The relationship between the United States and Pakistan is a tale of exaggerated expectations, broken promises, and disastrous misunderstandings. That's how our guest today, Husain Haqqani, opens his new book, Magnificent Delusions, United States, Pakistan, and the Global Jihad. We're delighted to welcome him to the University of Ottawa, to SIPS, and to Ottawa today to shed light not only on the difficult relationship between Pakistan and America, and he lived that relationship directly as that country's ambassador to the U.S., but I'm sure he'll also help us to understand the current political unrest and mass protests that have been taking place in Pakistan and their implications for the country's future and for the future of this unsettled region. And no doubt in the question period, some of you will be interested to hear his views on Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan and his views on the future of Afghanistan as well. Mr. Haqqani is currently the Director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute in Washington. He's also Professor of Practice of International Relations at Boston University. I think it's fair to say that he's something of a modern Renaissance man. He's been a journalist, an academic, and a diplomat, in addition to serving as advisor to 4 Pakistani prime ministers. Please welcome Husain Haqqani.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure coming and speaking to you here in Ottawa. I have not been to Ottawa in such a long time that I was wondering whether somebody here even remembers me anymore. And then I run into one of my oldest friends right in the front of the audience. So obviously forgotten, but not completely written off. Let me just begin by saying that the US-Pakistan relationship is not just a relationship, it's actually the story of Pakistan in many ways. And that's why I strongly advise, and I know that, you know, we live in a capitalist world, so advertising is not forbidden. Basically, here's the commercial break. This is the book, available on Amazon in case you want it. And it actually tells the story of Pakistan in some ways. So even the current crisis, you can actually see it in that context. And let me explain the background. Now, Pakistanis, of course, we are very articulate, a lot of us. We speak English, which enables us to connect especially to the English-speaking world. Most of us are very hospitable, very warm, so we develop a lot of relationships around the world. And so people sometimes find it difficult to understand the Pakistan, the country, and the Pakistanis they know. And somehow, sometimes we actually end up becoming bad interpreters of events because we are always trying to put a positive, nice spin or gloss. And that has been the problem of the last 67 years. But here are the basic facts. Of all the countries in that region, Pakistan is the youngest. There was no Pakistan before 1947. There's been an India for 5,000 years. There's been an Afghanistan for a few hundred years. There's been an Iran, Persia for a few thousand years. China for a few thousand years. Pakistan is the youngest country. In many ways, it was a created country, a imagined country. But it was not completely and fully imagined because, after all, it started out with 2 wings. What is today Bangladesh was part of Pakistan until 1971. Its founding father did not belong to the geographic area that became Pakistan. He had lived all his life in Bombay, and I will show in my book that he actually wanted to go back to Bombay and retire there and die there. So there was no organic relationship between the mass of the population and the idea that came about. And the idea was that the Muslims of South Asia should have a country. But here was the problem. Any geographic division of India would not create a country where a bulk of the Muslims of South Asia would be able to be there, because 1/3 were in what is today Pakistan, 1/3 what is today Bangladesh, but 1/3 would still remain behind in India. And so, in the effort to create this country, a lot of the leaders who were personally very westernized and secular resorted to religious sloganeering. So when Pakistan was created, there was a lot of confusion in the minds of the average man of what he's creating. Is he creating a homeland to which he will belong geographically, or is it going to be an Islamic state, or is it going to be the recreation of the Muslim caliphate? Now, nowadays, everybody's become familiar with the caliphate and all that, but in 1947, you can imagine somebody at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's a relatively small Ministry of Foreign Affairs that must have existed in Ottawa at that time, and the relatively small and not very knowledgeable State Department that existed in Washington, D.C., and them sort of having to deal with this. And there was another big problem, and that problem was that what is today Pakistan accounted for almost 1/3 of British India's army. That had to do with British recruitment policies for the Second World War and even before. So in the partition, Pakistan got 1/3 of the army, but only 17% of the resources. And the elite that was going to run the country, most of them came from areas that did not belong to Pakistan. This is all important to understand, because that's how this country has been shaped. That's why it moves from crisis to crisis. That's why if it's not one issue, it's another. If it's not a cleric who's causing trouble, it's a former cricketer. Something or the other keeps happening. And that happens primarily because of these whole roots. And you can't understand the Pakistan crisis without understanding these roots. So Pakistan ended up with a large army. Now, what would you do if you inherited an army which was 1/3 of the former empire that you were carved out of, but you had only 17% of the resources? There are two sensible decisions. One is to stand the army down so that you don't have to pay for it. The other is what Pakistan did, which is we will make ourselves useful for whatever is happening in the world and thereby get others to pay for our army. And that is how the Pakistani-US relationship was born. President Roosevelt did not think much of Pakistan. In fact, when he was told that these people are demanding this country in India, he thought it was a bad idea. Almost all Americans who covered the partition thought that the partition did not make sense. Yet, the British urged the Americans to establish diplomatic relations with Pakistan, and so an embassy ended up in Karachi right from day one. But the internal American evaluation of the post-independence of South Asia scenario was, India is going to be our natural ally. Pakistan, we should just make sure it doesn't go communist. But the Pakistani elite played that very well. And they played it by saying, you know what, we want to be your allies. And from 1947 to up to 1952, actually the Americans said, no, we want to be helpful. You want some assistance, etc. We will help you, but we don't want you as allies. We don't want you as military partners. And Pakistan was constantly marketing its military to the West. You know, we have so many soldiers. They're going to fight communism. In between that, Pakistan's elite had also decided that if we're going to maintain this large army, and of course there was the Kashmir dispute, which was genuine, and then the Pakistanis did feel a threat from India, which was much larger and which had not agreed to the idea of Pakistan, but had consented to it very grudgingly. But they decided that that can actually be a way of unifying the nation. Because within a few days of independence, issues had started cropping up. What was then East Pakistan was the numerical majority of the new country. And their language was Bengali. But the elite that was going to govern the country, their language was Urdu. Ironically, even in West Pakistan, Urdu was the mother tongue of only 2% of the people, according to the 1951 census. Yet they decided to make Urdu the national language. So there were riots in East Pakistan within 6 months of independence over language. And since then, it has always been a problem. Is Pakistan going to be a multi-ethnic state, even multi-religious? Even on that side, what was the original conception of the scheme of partition? What is today Pakistan would have had 23% non-Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs. But nobody anticipated the riots at the time of partition. So when the riots occurred and everybody got insecure, and then of course there was a serious effort by hardline religious elements in Indian Punjab, as well as in Pakistan. So Indian Punjab became cleansed of Muslims, and what is today Pakistan, West Pakistan, ended up becoming cleansed of Hindus and Sikhs. There are no Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan of any significance. Instead of 23% minorities, Pakistan's minorities now are only 3%. Pakistan is a 97% Muslim country. So all of this provided the context. The Americans decided initially that this is not their business. Pakistan wants to fight a war in Kashmir against India, not our business, we just need to make sure they don't fight. And they were quoting India while being engaged with Pakistan. But the Pakistani charm was working even in Karachi at that time. The Prime Minister used to invite even second secretaries from the American embassy. Now, I don't know how many of you are diplomats, have some diplomatic background, or know about diplomacy enough, or have watched television shows about diplomacy to know the second secretary is like really the poor, lowest rung of the totem pole. The poor second secretary, nobody pays attention to anywhere. You know, they usually carry the ambassador's bag. If the ambassador is a mean guy, if he's a nice guy, they walk behind him 2 steps, right? And so when these second secretaries were being invited by the Prime Minister, who used to play drums in jazz sessions, they all wrote back glowing reports on behalf of the ambassador, because the ambassador seldom writes stuff, you know, unless, so they're writing a book, which is available on Amazon.com. Did I tell you that? So they wrote these glowing reports about this country's, like, they love America. They want us. But what was going on was that the country was virtually bankrupt, had no money. And so basically what they were doing was they were asking for Uncle Sam to put in money so that the country could actually continue to function. Hence, the relationship, the story of the relationship between the US and Pakistan being the story of Pakistan. Because Pakistan's first request to America for aid was $2 billion in 1947. $2 billion, 1947. The Americans gave $10 million. So you can see the difference between the expectation and the reality. But it also created another effect. It created an effect in Pakistan that, you know, America, wooing America, getting money from America was all important, and getting weapons from America would help us be able to compete with India. By 1952, the US had a new government. President Eisenhower got elected, and his Secretary of State was a man called John Foster Dulles, who made up for his lack of knowledge of the world with his enthusiasm for American leadership of the world. And his ignorance about the rest of the world was legendary. So he, for example, decided to go to India and Pakistan. The Indians turned around and said, look, we are going to create an arc of military alliances around the Soviet Union and China. China had gone communist in 1949. And Dulles went to India, and the Indians refused. They said, we are going to be non-aligned. We are a poor country, we're an underdeveloped country, we'll take from the Soviets what we can take from the Soviets, we'll take from the Chinese what we can take from the Chinese, we'll take from you what we can take from you. We are not becoming aligned. We are not becoming militarily involved. And when he went to Pakistan, of course, they were eager. They said, absolutely. And our military commander at that time, Field Marshal Ayub Khan, used a sentence that's in the official State Department records of the meeting. He said, our army will be your army as long as you pay for it. And Dulles, totally, you know, unmindful of what the Pakistan Army's role was likely to be at home or in the region or towards India, etc. He said, those Indians, they don't care about fighting communism, but the Pakistanis do. And he came back with his enthusiasm, coupled with his ignorance. And there's a famous conversation between him and Walter Lippmann, the columnist. There's at least a couple of people in this audience who are as old as me, so might remember Walter Lippmann. The young ones don't. He was a more informed and sensible version of Thomas Friedman in the 1950s and 60s. So he was a foreign policy writer. Anyway, so Walter Lippmann confronted Dulles and said, Foster, what are you doing having Pakistan in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization? Pakistan is not in Southeast Asia. I mean, it's Vietnam, etc. The distance from Pakistan, even East Pakistan is only at the fringe of it. So why are you including Pakistan? The army is all based in West Pakistan. And Dulles decided to lecture him, and he said, look here, Walter, we need somebody to fight the commies in the south of Asia. And the Brits tell me that the only people who know how to fight in that region are the Gurkhas. So I have signed on Pakistan as allies. So Lippmann turned around and said, but Foster, the Gurkhas are not Pakistanis. He said, oh, I thought they were Muslims. At which point Lippmann had to say, no, they are not Muslims either, they are Hindus. Of course, we all know Gurkhas are Hindus from Nepal, have nothing to do with either India or Pakistan, and obviously have nothing to do with fighting communism either. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Pakistan became an ally, arms started flowing, aid started coming. 1954, Pakistan was on the verge of famine. What later on became Public Law 480 of giving American wheat aid, etc., food aid to third world countries, that was originally the Pakistan Aid Act. It was a law made specifically for Pakistan to be able to give them surplus wheat from the American wheat stock. And that's how the Americans kind of got into Pakistan, on a total false premise. A, that they are enrolling the Gurkhas in the great fight against communism, and B, that they will have an army that they will pay for. Well, year by year, calendar was made of how much modernization and equipment Pakistan will be provided. Places were provided for Pakistani military officers in military institutions all over the free world, including Canada at that time. So our officers showed up here in your military institutions, etc., etc. And in between, the military decided that, you know what, this process of democracy, etc., is too complicated to manage this good relationship. The Americans had no role in it. They didn't want a coup in Pakistan, but they didn't mind one. And Ayub Khan, who was their main interlocutor, took over and became the president. And of course, everybody thought he was tall, he was a nice presence, he spoke good English. As Henry Kissinger later on wrote, good product of Sandhurst, you know. So they assumed, how could he be wrong? But here was the problem. Every time the Americans would say, okay, now, you know, we are about to fight the communists in Korea, can you send some troops? The Pakistanis said, absolutely, just sending you a brigade. However, first we have to just deal with this little problem we have with India in Kashmir. Then Vietnam, Laos, Americans asked, and Ayub Khan actually said, when requested for a brigade, he said, a brigade is too small. I will give you a division, 10,000 men, to go to Laos, but only on condition that you help me against India. Now, the Americans were never interested in helping Pakistan against India, hence the title of my book, Magnificent Delusions. What is the delusion I'm talking about? The American delusion that if we just arm and equip this military, it will become our military. And we don't need to worry about institutional arrangements in this country, we don't need to worry about the foundations of this country, we don't need to worry about the whole internal ethnic arrangements, we don't need to worry about, it's not a country for a long time, so it's really just evolving, we don't need to worry about what they're teaching their children in school, about religion. We don't need to worry about the fact that they are having international conferences. A lot of the problems we see today about radical Islam, they were actually the prototype of those problems was developed in Pakistan way before radical Islam became fashionable elsewhere. When the Arabs, especially the nationalist Arabs, were all secular, beginning with Nasser, etc., etc., were westernizers in a cultural sense, while not being pro-Western in a military sense and a political sense. Pakistan was an Islamizer. It wanted everybody to be more religiously conservative. The debates were already taking place in Pakistan. In my first book, which is also available on Amazon.com, by the way, Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, I show that it's erroneous to think that Ziaul Haq made Pakistan Islamist. Ziaul Haq accentuated it, moved it faster, but the Islamization of Pakistan started from 1949. And that was mainly because what is the reason for our country? Why are we there? And so religion became, you know, the only way to shut up ethnic groups wanting, you know, why don't you allow my language to be taught in schools? It's all about Islam. Shut up. You know, we are a Muslim country. Your language, my language doesn't matter. We are all the same. And when smaller groups like Sindhis, Baluch would say, why are we not represented in the military? Or the Bengalis would say, why are we not in the high ranks of the civil service? Brothers, we are all Muslim. Doesn't matter whether the civil servant is Punjabi or Bengali, so let's have a Punjabi civil servant. So that kind of attitude was the attitude of the elite, primarily a Punjabi elite from one ethnic group, one area from where the military came. Relationship moves forward. By 1964, Pakistan's military feels it's very modern, it's got the equipment, etc., etc. And what do? They launch a war with India in 1965. And that's when Lyndon Johnson hits the roof and gets angry and says, but that's not what they were supposed to do. They were not supposed to use our equipment against India. And that's the first time Pakistan came under American sanctions. They stopped supply of spare parts to both belligerents, India and Pakistan, but India wasn't accepting American military equipment, so it wasn't a restriction on India. But in Pakistan, the national narrative became that, the Americans are fair weather friends, they didn't support us, etc., etc. And then, of course, we know about the 1971 war, when Pakistan broke up, the Bangladeshis, East Bengalis finally got fed up of being dominated, wanted freedom. Richard Nixon tilted towards Pakistan because he wanted to pay back the new Pakistani military dictator, Yahya Khan. And there's an episode in the book where Nixon actually, because I went to the Nixon library, I heard all the tapes, Nixon actually told Henry Kissinger, these guys are committing suicide. The country's going to break up. But you know what? Yahya Khan is my friend, so I'm going to support him. Which is a very strange and wrong way of making foreign policy. It raises Pakistan's hopes that the Americans are going to come and help us in fighting our own population. But you're just doing it because he helped you reach out to China. The only time when there was really effective and serious cooperation was in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But there, again, Pakistan was the proxy. They helped create the jihad. No American physically went into Afghanistan because they didn't want to run into the situation where they would actually be taken prisoner by the Soviets, and that could become a whole problem. So they wanted to, for deniability's sake, they did it all out of Pakistan. Americans thought they were fighting Charlie Wilson's war. I'm sure people have seen the movie or read the book. But I point out that it wasn't Charlie Wilson's war for Pakistan. It was Ziaul Haq's war. What he was trying to do was, his obsession and focus on India required that we focus on, make sure that Afghanistan does not become a friend or ally of India. And then, of course, the Soviets left, Americans left the region. Pakistani narrative, partly true, is that the Americans left, so what could we do? There were all these armed people from all over the world who had come. Although there were options that Pakistan could have pursued, which I have argued for when I was in Pakistan while serving there, and in things like supporting the Taliban was not necessary. But it was all connected to what I call the Pakistani paradigm. The Pakistani paradigm is, Islam is our national unifier, India is our permanent enemy, and America must support us to be able to, it basically is the underwriter of our economy and our military. That has had really stunting consequences for Pakistan. So I'm waiting for questions and answers because I don't want to give a very long lecture. I think I am almost close to the time that I'm supposed to stop talking. I'll expect questions on current situation and I'll connect the dots for you. A lot of Pakistan's dysfunction, and the dysfunction is apparent. In 1947, what is today Pakistan had a literacy rate of 16%, 1/6. What is today India had a literacy rate of 18%, 2% difference. Today, what is today the remainder of India after partition, it has a literacy rate of 75%. Pakistan's literacy rate is 55%. The 2% has become a 20% difference. 1/3 of school-going age children of Pakistan don't go to any kind of school. Not madrasa, not any school. 1/3 of a very young population. Median age is 21. Half the population is below the age of 21. The national narrative is all about global conspiracies against Islam, etc. So we have the vice chancellor of Pakistan's largest university, Punjab University, is a physicist by the name of Dr. Mujahid Kamran. Google him. He got a PhD in physics from Edinburgh University. He also got a Fulbright in physics to come to America at one point. So he was, I think, in one of the universities in Georgia. But guess what? As vice chancellor, he's written a book last year which on the one hand says that 9/11 was an American inside job to find an excuse to be able to attack Muslim countries. Conspiracy theory that you find on the web considerably, but he says something else, which from a physicist you don't expect because it's something that's a physically verifiable thing, and anybody who's been brought up on an empirical education would argue that, okay, I should need to check it. And I'll tell you the story as soon as I've told you what he claims. He claims that the West is controlled by a cabal of bankers, which you know is a phrase from Mein Kampf, a reference to Jews. And he says it's controlled by a cabal of bankers who implant microchips in the heads of leaders especially in the third world and the Muslim world, and manipulate those leaders with those microchips. As an unabashedly pro-Western, pro-American, Pakistani political figure, I actually volunteered and said, this head is available for a physical experimentation. Find the damned microchip, take it out, it'll make you happy, and it'll probably free me of this illness of wanting Pakistan to change. And of course, there was no reason, it's totally fabricated. So for a PhD, but what worries me more is not that he said it. There are crazies in academia all over the world. Nobody laughed at that. Everybody takes it all very seriously.
We know.
But once he had said that, I mean, if it was a top university vice chancellor or president here, his children would go to him and say, Dad, you need to see a psychiatrist. This man has not been removed from his position. He's still heading the country's largest university. So that shows you something about Pakistan's national discourse, which doesn't always come out when you see day-to-day reporting. You see the conflict part, you see the war part. So here's what I will summarize. The US-Pakistan relationship is why I call it a magnificent delusion, the American delusion that if we just put in money, and now by now, America has put in $40 billion in economic and military assistance in Pakistan since 1948. 40. The rest of you, Canada, Europe, Britain, have also poured in amounts which would probably total about 15 billion. So that's about $55 billion in foreign assistance in a 66-year period. Compare that with something like South Korea, where the American assistance was no more than $15 billion, or Taiwan, where it was about $10 billion. Look at them, how that 10 billion became a catalyst for a self-sustaining large economy with great foreign exchange reserves, etc. South Korea, a major economic powerhouse. Why couldn't Pakistan do it? And here's what I say. I say that the Americans were deluded that without getting Pakistan to change or give up on its policies, especially in relation to India, in relation to its own national identity, in relation to Afghanistan, just by being big donors, they will be able to change Pakistan and buy influence. I think that was a delusion. And Pakistan never gave a single troop for any of the anti-communist wars that the Americans engaged in, the minor wars that were fought, no major one with the Soviet Union, of course. Pakistan remained singularly focused on India. All American military equipment ended up being used. The military became disproportionately powerful in Pakistan as a result of this. Imagine a scenario in which America had decided Dulles had not been the foreign secretary, Secretary of State, and Dean Acheson's worldview had prevailed. Acheson was Truman's Secretary of State. And they would have said, okay, if India doesn't want to become our ally, we don't want Pakistan as an ally either. We don't need an ally in that region, we'll have friends, not allies. We don't really need to go into that theater because these guys have a problem and we don't want to become the support. Would the Pakistani military have been able to sustain this eternal conflict with India? Because obviously it had no money, it had no weapons. Even now, they want to come back to Uncle Sam every 2 years after abusing Uncle Sam because Uncle pays the bills. And India's economy now, of course, is kind of slowly, the wheels are turning, it's moving faster. So now they have money to buy stuff. So India plans to buy defense equipment of $200 billion over the next 5 years. The size of Pakistan's GDP, real GDP, is $236 billion. So how's Pakistan going to compete with India? So this is actually something the American relationship has sustained, the idea of Pakistan being able to compete. Now what is Pakistan's delusion? Pakistan's delusion was that just by receiving external assistance and playing these little games of, yeah, we are there for you whenever, want to fight the commies? Here we are. Want to take on the Soviets? Run a proxy war. Want to deal with Islamic terrorism after 9/11? Absolutely, no problem. The guys we supported, we know best how to get rid of them, etc., etc. That by doing that, Pakistan will become a stable, sustainable economy, strong country, and a country that can compete with India. I think that has proven to be a delusion. Some basic change needs to take place in Pakistan. Pakistan needs to look inward, focus on those children who are not going to school, focus on building a self-sustaining economy, stop thinking about external assistance constantly as a means of bolstering its military capability, make peace with India, get out of Afghanistan, because Pakistan, even though it's a nation of 180 million, even though it has the world's 5th largest military, the military is only one element of national power. There are other elements of national power that are lacking. A country whose foreign currency reserves dip each time an installment of foreign aid doesn't arrive on time needs to rethink its overall big strategic issue. And above all, Pakistan needs to get out of strategic delusions about being, it's an important country, it's my country, so I obviously love it, but it's a country that should not exaggerate its role in the world. The assumption that our strategic location makes it impossible for the rest of the world to ignore us has had strategically disastrous consequences of Pakistan. So that, in my opinion, is the issue here. We will talk about domestic politics, etc. when you frame smart questions for me. I think I'm done talking. Thank you all very much, and do buy and read the book when you can.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is still on. Thank you so much for that talk. You've given us a lot to chew on, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. I'd just like to restate our house rules regarding questions, which are: please identify yourself, please keep your question or comment brief, no long speeches, please, and please use the microphone. Rob will come over and give you the microphone so that we can record, have the entire session recorded. And who would like to kick off the questioning? Ferry?
Do I need a microphone?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Sid, for a fabulous presentation with all the humor that we've all known that you own and possess. In terms of conspiracy theory, I can vouch for what you said, because I arrived in Islamabad the day before Osama bin Laden was taken out, and every Pakistani asked me how I did it. And I said, very simple, and I pulled my BlackBerry and I said, plus 99 seals, piece of cake. And they believed me, so I'm with you.
I hope your and my BlackBerry contacts were not on that particular BlackBerry.
The delusion also, in terms that you haven't addressed, is the one on economic development. And is there any reality in saying that although India managed to develop better through land reform, Pakistan failed completely on that score, and why?
First of all, here's been the problem. If Pakistan had been a consistent democracy and the political parties, somebody would have had the strength someday to be able to sort of win an election on a platform of land reform and implement that land reform. What happened was we never had an election from 1947 to 1970. 1958 came the military coup. So 47 to 58, what we had was the feudal politicians who had been elected in 1946. They were able to re-elect themselves from within the assembly. The outgoing assembly would elect the new assembly, no recourse to the general electorate, which was a silly kind of arrangement. So that kept the land reform blocked. There was minor land reform then. Then Ayub Khan came, he did some land reform, but then he realized he didn't have a political support base. So what's the easiest way to get a support base in a country where you do have land-owning feudals with local ethnic or tribal or cultural loyalty? And lastly, because of Pakistan's overall structure of state, if you're a Sindhi, and the only language you speak is Sindhi, and the civil servants are all Punjabi, and you can't speak to them, you need an intermediary with them. So the landowner becomes your intermediary. And when he's at intermediary, he's assured of your vote if you have an election, which is what happened in 1970 and subsequent elections. So these things have to go hand in hand. Political reform, consistency of democracy, and land reform. The military can't do land reform because the military ends up needing those very feudals to create its facade of political success. The good thing is that Pakistan, it could be a good, it could be a bad thing, but I think it's a good thing. Pakistan now is much more urbanized. So in political terms, if Pakistan remains a democracy and we can have 2-3 consistent elections, as Samuel Huntington pointed out, that democracy needs at least 2 or 3 successive sort of political changes through the democratic process. If we can have that, we may actually have a politician who can go to the people and say, you know what, I am going to implement land reform, vote for my party. and vote for me. And that may be the way to do it, because the ones who own the land aren't going to do the land reform. So that was one of the reasons. And the other side is that the military, with all the talk, the military uses the argument of land reform when it deposes the politicians, as Musharraf did, you might remember. And then you might remember also that I told you Musharraf won't be able to implement it, and he didn't, because within 2 to 3 years he realized, oops, I don't have a political support base. What's the easiest way? He calls all the tribal and the feudal chiefs and says, support me, and creates a support base out of them. And so then he postpones and puts off the reform. And it's not just the land reform. I mean, it's also many other things. The education is directly connected. Look, unless you have... I have no faith in Dr. Mujahid Kamran, who believes in conspiracy theories, to actually be a successful scientist, because it's an attitude. I mean, empiricism is an attitude. So and the technical education is falling behind. I mean, check with Immigration Canada. Young Pakistanis applying are very smart, they get here. But anybody who can make the cut comes here. Because once he has done well in his technical education, why should he stay there where he doesn't have the kind of opportunity? So it's all become like a vicious circle that will need a lot more than just land reform to change.
Nasser, and don't forget to introduce yourself, please.
Nasser Islam, retired professor of governance and public policy at Telford School of Management. Ambassador Haqqani, you've been through a long journey into the byways and secret passages of Pakistan's corridors of power. You've been through Jamiat-e-Tulaba Islam, to Noon League, to PPP, and know the Pakistani politics inside out. I'm asking you a serious question. Do you see in foreseeable future any possibility that Pakistan's military establishment, particularly its secret agencies, can be made responsible and accountable to the Parliament, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet? And as a footnote to this question, a question directly for you personally is that, was it really useful in hindsight to try to make these agencies responsible to civilian government by inserting something or a clause in Kerry-Lugar-Burman legislation?
First of all, the Kerry-Lugar-Burman legislation was not made by Pakistan, so no Pakistani inserted any clause in it. The clauses were inserted by the Americans because they felt the need to do that by making their aid conditional. I personally think that there is nothing wrong with conditionality of aid as long as it's policy conditions and not, others. And very frankly, the Pakistani military and intelligence service may have reacted at that time and created a hoopla and demanded my head for, ostensibly being involved in putting those conditions in, which I was not. The fact remains that those conditions are one of the reasons why the Pakistan military is, at this moment, being a lot more cautious. That's the reason why they need Tahir al-Qadri and Imran Khan as fronts, rather than come in directly. Because the legislation is too specific. So was it useful? We won't know until, Chou En-lai's response when he was asked about the consequences of the French Revolution. It's too early to tell. So was the Kerry-Lugar bill successful? I think that the dependence on foreign assistance of the Pakistani military still remains so formidable that, and you know that, look, most countries sell military equipment. And Pakistan is in no position to buy. We just don't have the hard currency to buy. So that is one of the reasons why they they foment anti-Americanism and go America, go protests and everything. They orchestrate them like they did immediately after bin Laden. And yet, they always come back, hat in hand, and asking for assistance, because America does give military assistance. Only recently, the Pakistani military has made a request that, the used equipment from Afghanistan that you are not going to take back, because sometimes the cost of bringing it back to America is too high. So Pakistan's military has actually had the used equipment from Korea, the used equipment from the Gulf War, and now they want the used equipment from Afghanistan. They also made a request for the used equipment for Iraq. That was made while I was ambassador, so I remember that distinctively. And the argument at that time was bringing it from Iraq to Pakistan was not feasible because it couldn't be brought on on trailers from containers from Iraq through Iran into Pakistan. So that's my answer to that part. Will they relinquish? No, they won't. They don't want to. Here's the problem. There are two other good books, by the way, so I'm being fair here, not just promoting my own. One is Christine Fair's book, Fighting to the End, The Pakistan Army's Way of War. It's a very good book because she has actually studied all the Pakistani military journals, internal, it's a content analysis book. Shows what their mind is about war. And basically it's like, and she has a very interesting cover, which is a carousel. So the general sitting on a carousel. They just won't give up. Like 1971 wasn't a big defeat. East Pakistan would have gone anyway. They've never actually analyzed their own defeat and accepted that maybe competing with and fighting India is not really Pakistan's way forward. So that's on the domestic front. The other book is a book by Aqil Shah, who has written a very good book called Democracy and the Military, or Politics and the Military. I can't remember the exact title, but in it he analyzes how in the National Defense University, etc., the Pakistani military spent something like 65% of its time discussing non-military matters, because they have convinced themselves that they are the only force and only institution that keeps Pakistan together. Those Baloch, instead of considering them as people of Pakistan, that those Baloch who disagree with Pakistan right now, for example, in Canada you had a problem with Quebec for years, but you always thought of Quebecers as Canadians who were unhappy with the federal arrangement. So what kind of federal arrangement can we give them? That was the attitude. Here, the Pakistani military says, those Baloch, they are not happy with Pakistan. How do we crush them? Those Sindhis, they are not happy with Pakistan. They are not good Pakistanis. That Pakistani ambassador to Washington, idiot, has now changed his mind and he has new ideas about us. How do we get rid of him? This prime minister, he wants peace with India. He must be a traitor. That mindset will take a very long time to end. So the expectation that they will do it voluntarily is not going to happen. It's going to be force of circumstance and fiat of politics or economics that will make them change.
There's a couple more questions. Hands, I see the woman at the back, and then we'll come up to the front.
My name is Anu Bose, and I used to teach South Asian Studies at the University of Birmingham in the UK. I was going to ask you if it is fair for you to comment on the industries, the military-industrial complex in Pakistan, like things like the Fauji Fund and things like that.
Well, I mean, I could comment on it, but there's a lot of literature on it already. I mean, for example, the only brand of cereal you can eat in Pakistan is called Fauji cereal. Fauji literally means military. So they have a monopoly over making cereal, and there are certain, there's a sugar mill. I mean, actually, you can actually have an entire life in which you can, if you're an agriculturist, you can be using fertilizer made in a military-owned fertilizer factory. You can use a tractor from a factory that assembles tractors, which they run. So they are in business that way. They would argue, the military generals would argue, that this is actually for our welfare institutions. It's like the VA in America, although the VA doesn't run industry. And some people argue, although I'm not fully convinced of that argument, I'm more convinced of the argument that it's become like an ideology. And ideologies are more difficult to change. But some people argue that it's become a business interest. My view is that even if we decide to give, okay, every military officer will have $1 million in his bank account by the time he retires, as long as he gives up politics or interfering in Pakistan's policy making, they won't do it. Because they are convinced, as I said earlier, they are convinced that they are what hold Pakistan together. And so the business side is important, but it is not, in my opinion, the defining factor. But that's just my opinion. There's a good book on that called Military Inc., by Dr. Aisha Siddiqa, and she makes that argument that this is all about business because each one of them ends up, I mean, General Musharraf, for example, every civilian politician, if they end up much richer at the end of their tenure than they were when they got into office, everybody assumes, and rightly so, that they must have engaged in some kind of corruption unless they have an explanation for which stocks they bought that went so high that they are so rich. But the generals, when they retire, they are much richer, and their explanation usually is, but that was our benefits that came from our various business things that the military runs for us. So each one of them ends up with multiple plots of land, multiple houses, which they can sell on the open property market. I mean, I don't think that in Ottawa, for example, the best neighborhood to live is called the military neighborhood, But in Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, Gujranwala, the best real estate is in what is known as Defense Housing Authority estates. And that is not necessarily the best way for civilianizing the nation.
Understatement. A woman in the second row, please.
Yes, thank you for your conference. I'm Louise Ouimet. I'm the president of the Africa Study Group, but I have an interest in Pakistan because I managed a project there in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in 2011 and 13. Well, I would like to hear you about the recent unrest and all why did Imran Khan and this other guy, I can't remember his name, who's also Canadian. Yeah, who's also a Canadian. Why, after a year after the election, decide to demand Nawaz Sharif resign? Yeah.
Well, Imran Khan argues that the election which resulted in Nawaz Sharif's victory was rigged. And my comment on that is that that's a bit like Al Gore saying 15 months into the Bush presidency, oh, by the way, the election was not fair, so let's have another election. I mean, if he had objections to the election, he should have called about the rigging of the election right after the election. He has support of a lot of young people because there are young Punjabis, people in Punjab. By the way, so is Qadri, so is Nawaz Sharif. So those of us who are not from Punjab, we are kind of looking at it as like, this is a little circus that we are watching from afar. We have other issues to worry about. We are worried about our bread and butter issues and the rights of our different ethnic groups, etc. in a federal Pakistan. But these guys are fighting, and there's lots of evidence that Imran and Tahir al-Qadri have been egged on or winked and nodded at by some elements in the Pakistani security establishment. They are unhappy with Nawaz Sharif over three things. Sharif has decided that Pakistan is not going to play any further role in Afghanistan's internal politics. They do not agree with that. They still think that when the Americans leave, to prevent Afghanistan from becoming an American ally, Pakistan should back somebody there. And their candidates are the Haqqani network, no relationship, the Haqqani network and the Taliban still. And Sharif's attempt to try and stop that is looked upon by the military as an attempt to limit their strategic options. Second, Sharif is really keen on opening trade with India. When he went to Modi's inauguration, everybody in the world welcomed it except the Pakistani military and the civilians in Pakistan who are now known as they're known as the Pakistani nationalist or ultra-nationalist elements, who said Sharif should not have gone there without raising Kashmir. Now the problem is that if you go to India and raise Kashmir, then the Indians won't talk to you. And for him, it's more important to have trade. He's a businessman. Okay, he probably has some personal business interests also because the things he wants to open are steel and sugar trade, both of which are his businesses. But fair enough, but Pakistan as a country will also benefit. There's no point in us having a steel surplus if we can't sell it to anybody. And anybody who's been in the steel business will tell you that the easiest thing to do is a relatively closer market, because you can load it on wagons and you can send it across. It's the price efficiency is there. So he wants trade to open with India, and the military does not. The military argues, and I used to have a lot of arguments as ambassador. I had a lot of arguments anyway. I kept it all in good humor, but Ferry will tell you, I probably ended up having lots of arguments with the generals when I was serving as ambassador. I don't know how they tolerated me for 3.5 years. In the end, they didn't tolerate me, but I'm always surprised at, because I always used to wait every Friday that, today the cable will come, you're fired, but they never got me fired early enough. I think it was the support of the civilian government. President Zardari and Prime Minister Gilani stood by me. But I used to have arguments with them, and they couldn't understand the economic argument, because I guess as a military officer, you're not trained to understand the economic argument. They never understood. They said, why can't we trade with America? Why can't we trade with... And I said, most countries that prosper, a significant amount of their trade is with their neighbors. So Pakistan has nothing to sell of significance to Iran. We don't want to do it to Afghanistan because they didn't have the purchasing power before. The country that has the money to buy our products is India. And then there's so much cultural compatibility and language compatibility that it's a natural market. So for example, Indian women wear Pakistani style clothes as well. And so we could export those. But they didn't understand it. So they didn't want it. And the third thing Nawaz Sharif did wrong from their point of view was he decided to put Musharraf on trial. And the Pakistani military's worldview, a general never is to be put on trial by the civilians. They never allowed the people who were responsible for massacres in East Pakistan in 1971, they never allowed them to be put on trial. They never allowed the people to be put on trial who were responsible for making IJI and diverting government funds for political purposes in 1988 against Benazir Bhutto in 1990. Never. And they don't want Musharraf tried. So they have been instrumental in encouraging. Mr. Qadri is a religious cleric. He left Pakistan in 2004, I think, came to Toronto, found people here. He got a lot of following amongst the more pious Muslims because he's a good religious orator, and so people turned to him. He collected a lot of money from them. Then first he went 2 years ago to Pakistan. I am bringing a revolution with his 30, 40,000 followers who consider him like a saint. And they're just sitting with him, and then they froze. And Zardari handled them very nicely, sort of, sent tea for everybody, the government party ended up showing up with food and tea for these demonstrators, so then they slowly, and every time said, why are you sitting in the cold, go home, and some of them went. This time, he has the partner in Imran Khan. Now, Imran Khan's advantage is that he has that whole cricket reputation, but he's also a relatively good-looking man, which appeals to some people, I guess, in politics. And then the third thing is he has built his reputation as this Mr. Clean. I have not been politically corrupt. But that's it. That's it. I mean, he has shown no political wisdom ever, doesn't seem to understand constitutional issues, doesn't understand, political. So he just wants, he thinks he's 62. If he doesn't become prime minister now, it'll be too late for him. So he's putting the pressure on that. Both of them have cult-like followers. Truth is, there's no massive, yes, there's 30,000 followers of one and 30,000 followers of another. So 60,000 people is a lot of people in a demonstration sit-in outside parliament. But it's a nation of 180 million. Should a prime minister resign every time 60,000 people come and stage a sit-in against him and start taking baths outside the parliament, instead of the millions of votes he got? Underlying, however, is also that the urban educated middle class, that by and large has been apolitical in the past, is really frustrated with the major political parties. So the college students, etc., who are part of this whole Imran phenomenon, and that's why the Imran phenomenon is a stronger phenomenon on online, Facebook, Twitter. They're just like rather abusive and poor language, but that reflects on Pakistan's educational system. But these are college kids mainly, and Pakistani college kids who've become enthralled by it, and they just want it quickly, and Imran is their hero. My fear is that it'll just be a deadlock that will just last for a long time, and if it lasts too long, the military can intervene, and if it does not last too long, there will be some use of force by one side or the other. Either way, Pakistan is not going to benefit.
We have time for a few more questions. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one now, if you don't mind. I think that what you've set out very articulately is a description of why the current situation is locked into a certain pattern, both within Pakistan and in the bilateral relationship between Pakistan and the United States. What is less clear is whether there's any prospect at all of breaking out of these patterns, both the diplomatic pattern and the internal political pattern. You suggested that there might be, broader economic, political conditions. Can you be more specific about what would be required?
Well, what would be required is a more complex question, and maybe sometimes not giving prescriptions is a better way of doing it, because I always say that coming to America, I found that Americans always want to look at the world as a problem for them to solve. I always say, no, look at it as a situation for you to understand. So then once you've understood, then we can all reflect on how to change things and all that. So we know what needs to be done. Pakistan needs to invest in education, etc. But how we will reach there? First, I think that the American trough, in which everybody's everybody's been snorting for a while, that trough, I think, is going to shut down anyway by circumstances, because the Kerry Lugar money is running out this year. I don't think Congress will renew it. I think bin Laden had a tremendous effect on America, which Pakistanis don't realize. Americans, the day after that, 2 days after that, I went to Congress. I was the ambassador at that time. And congressmen who were dear friends of mine said, Hussain, I hope you know your job has become 3 times, maybe 10 times more difficult, because now my constituents have turned against Pakistan. You've always heard about opinion polls in which 83% of Pakistanis say they don't like the US. Well, guess what? For the first time, 73% of Americans don't like Pakistan anymore either. And that makes it very difficult for America to continue to sort of send so much money to Pakistan and its military. So that will be one factor. India, second, India's rise. China, India. For the first time, the Chinese president is going to India without coming to Pakistan, because he wanted to come to Pakistan to keep the relationship sort of again. But Pakistan, because of the riots, they decided to cancel it. He's going instead to attend Modi's birthday party in his hometown. That is going to be a new entente that will make Pakistan, on the one hand, it will feed the paranoia about Pakistan being a constantly beleaguered state, which therefore needs to be a garrison, But it may also help create that opening where people like me will be heard, and people will say, no, this guy is not really a traitor. He's actually a relatively sensible man who, as a little kid, was in the Islamic groups, etc., has grown and he understands that this is just not feasible. And that may, and other people who probably have said it far longer than people will be heard. So that option is there on the political side. Domestic politics is a little more complex. We really have no knights in shining armor. But my answer to that is, if you look back at political history of other countries, sometimes very ordinary wheeler-dealer politicians have delivered significant changes. And so that could happen. But I think most of these exogenous or external factors are going to be significant in case of Pakistan. The Americans turning back, unless the Americans start a new round of delusion, which they are perfectly capable of, with all respect and affection for them. But unless that happens, I think Pakistan's strategic chickens are now coming home to roost, and that may be the basis for change.
There was a question in the back here, and then we'll go.
Yeah, George Jacoby, retired diplomat. I had some experience on Asian nuclear non-proliferation questions. So I wanted to ask you about the Pakistani nuclear program, its genesis, its development, its export through the AQ Khan network, and its effect on relations with both the United States and Canada, and how that figures in your book and in your theory. I just might mention that I was on the desk before Pakistan tested. We were certainly concerned about the safety of the CANDU-based Canup nuclear reactor, and we allowed a little bit of nuclear safety assistance at the time. I don't think we could do that now, since Pakistan has tested. But on the other hand, India has come into sort of modified its relations, its international nuclear relations, and Canada now can cooperate with India, but it can't with Pakistan, which remains outside the NPT. How is that going to be resolved?
Well, first of all, again, the rational options are very much there, but as I have said, I hope everybody will go home with one line that I want everybody to remember. All I'm saying is that Pakistan should be understood in the ideological context rather than the purely rational context. This has been a big mistake people have historically made. They've always assumed Pakistan's military is just a security-seeking military, it's all worried. No, it's made it into an ideology. So the nuclear weapons have also unfortunately become part of that ideology. And so the ideological dimension is more difficult to check. The rational options, of course, are that Pakistan follows the Indian route, and we actually open ourselves to inspection, bring ourselves into some kind of restraint regime. We have nuclear weapons. We've tested them openly. Of course, Canadian policy on this was much better than American. There's a whole, I've explained the American folly on that. There were actually people in the Reagan administration who thought, what the heck, if they get nuclear weapons, what's the big deal? Because very frankly, they'll only use them against, I mean, not that they'll use them, but they'll only use them to threaten India. So that's not such a bad idea, which was a very short term and, in my opinion, very stupid way of looking at things. So going back to, like, demanding that Pakistan and India come under the NPT is no longer an option because they've already tested. But the Indian route is much better, which is a civil nuclear deal, which puts their military things separate and the civilian separate, and then gives you all access to the civilian as well as the military, military to the extent that it remains restrained. The problem in Pakistan is that part of the ideology that has evolved is that the West wants to defang the world's only Muslim nuclear power. And so therefore, I mean, I have an episode in the book which you will probably enjoy of an American diplomat telling me that, the American Geological Survey did a geological survey of Afghanistan and found all the minerals there. They offered to do something like that for Pakistan, and the Pakistani intelligence service objected that while they are doing a geological survey, they will be able to locate all our nuclear weapons, and then they will be able to take them out. And any amount of argument I made that, look, the Americans never stole Soviet Union's nuclear weapons while the Soviet Union existed. Why would they steal ours? Let's just be mature people and talk about it and cut a deal and come under some nuclear regime. A new one maybe. By the way, I personally think the NPT, there may have to be an NPT plus, in which you may have to add to the NPT to provide for India, Pakistan, and Israel, countries that already have nuclear weapons. Why let them be kind of outlaws instead of bringing them under some kind of a legal system? But that's me. But chances of me running Pakistan's policy are almost as much as, Imran Khan going back to cricket.
Got time for a couple more quick questions in the back side here, please. Yeah.
And I don't mind hanging out for 5-10 minutes after we are over for those who want to talk to me personally. So.
Mahmoud Naki, I just had a quick question. You've been an early adopter of Twitter. You have, you have 100,000 followers. I was wondering, is this your views on it? You share poetry on Saturdays and things like that. I was wondering your views on, is this a way of accessing new voices? Are these the same old voices? And what would be the best ways of using it to understand Pakistan better?
Well, I mean, a lot of Pakistanis take to Twitter to express themselves, and so it's a means of getting to a lot of people. I just use it to express myself. I think my followers are divided, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I have Pakistani followers, 1/3, 1/3 Indian, and 1/3 in the rest of the world. And so I just express my opinions. If I were back in Pakistan, I'd be doing the same thing, hopefully on television if I was allowed on Pakistani TV. A lot of us are using Twitter and Facebook as a means of getting opinions which have become quote-unquote non-kosher opinions in Pakistan. You can't say certain things in Pakistan, like this thing I said about the nuclear thing. I mean, it's like blasphemy in Pakistan, or saying that the blasphemy law should be revoked. That's also something you can't say anywhere. Or as I have done, started speaking out for the Ahmadis, who I think are Pakistani citizens who have really been marginalized and very unfairly treated. Look, you can have any opinion on religion. There are people in North America who don't consider Mormons Christians. There are Christians who don't consider them Christians. There are Catholics who don't consider Protestants Christians. But you can't make a law about it, let alone make a constitutional amendment that forbids them forever to, have any privileges or many privileges of citizenship. So those are arguments I use on Twitter. Good thing is somehow, even though I can be very, shall we say, I can talk long when I need to, Twitter trains me how to say the same things in 140 characters.
Oh, that's quite a discipline. Last question over here, please.
My name is Tamreez Khan, and I'm a fellow Pakistani. In all our discussions about Pakistan and its current and past history, it's always the military that we talk about, including today's discussion. But none of us really talk about the civilian aspect of the country and how much that has messed us up as well. And if we do talk about that, it's always in the context of the relationship of the civilian government with the military. But our civilian governments have also not exactly had the best or the clearest of past. And that continues to this day, as we've been recycling our leaders for the last 20 years or so. And there's no new blood coming up, excluding Imran Khan. So,
if you consider 62-year-old a new blood, yeah.
Well,
who's been in politics since 1997?
Granted,
so
but
he's not new blood either in age or in terms of his longevity in politics. I get your point. I mean, basically it's about the politicians and the civilians not being that great and all that, but I think I did allude to all of that. I did talk about it. The point is that the civilians have never had a free run. Never, never, never. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, I demonstrated it in my first book, how many constraints he operated under from the military and the intelligence services. Benazir Bhutto, thrown out twice from government, not allowed to complete her term with a clear parliamentary majority after winning a vote of no confidence against her, defeating it. Evidence in the Supreme Court of Pakistan that that she was thrown out at the behest of the military. Evidence produced that the election was subsequently rigged. So my point is that yes, we have flawed political leaders, so does Canada. I mean, I've just come from Toronto. When you talk about structural flaws, then the individuals' problems are important, but they're not the thing you talk about. If Pakistan had consistent elections, I will have no problem with Imran Khan winning the next election. If he allowed the next election to take place in a normal fashion, did not hobnob with the inter-services intelligence to undermine Pakistan's democratic order, did not conspire, he would be fine. And new blood you talk about, new blood normally comes through this situation. You elect a Rob Ford, and then you realize that you need to elect someone else. And that's how new blood comes in democracies. So when you do not allow the consistent process, I mean, India, they had families, this, that, but a guy who served tea at a tea stall is now their prime minister. How did that happen? That happened through the process. So those of us who emphasize the military are not trying to ignore and gloss over the flaws and weaknesses of our politicians. We are actually talking about the structural weakness which comes from the military, not just because of the civilians. Imagine a Pakistan in which, after creation of Pakistan in 1947, the election had been held, like in India, exactly when it was due, which was 1951. Imagine. So a set of people would have been elected. In 1955, there would have been a chance again to defeat some of them and elect somebody else. In 1960, there would have been a third chance. One of the governments may have fallen from internal changes, etc., so there may have been two elections instead of one. But the third election would have been in 65 instead of a war under Ayub Khan. 1970, we would have had another election. 75, we would have had. There would have been plenty of new blood if that would have happened. What happened instead? 1947, we got 1951, the Muslim League decided we are not going to have national elections, we are just going to go by provinces. In East Pakistan, new blood came. The new blood was anti-Muslim League by now in 1951. What did they do? They dissolved the assembly. 1953, the military started taking over policy, and the army chief became Minister of Defense in a parliamentary system, which is not something that happens anywhere. By 1958, the military had taken over. All the politicians who were in Pakistan's politics from 47 to 58, except those who swore an oath of loyalty to Ayub Khan, were disqualified. So brilliant people like Hussain Shahid Suhrawardi, Khan Abdul Qayyum Khan, all of them, Mumia Mumtaz Daultana, who were supposed to be the new blood under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they were all disqualified from politics. Then we waited until, from Ayub Khan's regime, a man called Zulfikar Ali Bhutto arose. By the time Bhutto had become a person in his own right, they didn't like him either. And so he got executed. So this business about, we fully understand the frustrations of those who find the Pakistani, hey, I work with them. Can you imagine the frustrations I have with some of them who do not have the vision, the education, etc., etc. But parliamentary democracy only allows for improvement by consistent movement forward, not by a military intervention every few years, and not by undermining it through military intelligence machinations. That's my thought for you to consider. Thank you.
We are out of time, but I don't think we can let you go without hearing a few thoughts from you on how this current political situation in Afghanistan is going to play out.
Afghanistan is difficult right now, partly because I think President Karzai created a situation in which two very able candidates, both of them have real problems with the process, but eventually they'll have to share power. They will have to share power, they'll have to have an agreement. Afghanistan would be, in my opinion, better off under a parliamentary system, because all multi-ethnic, such countries have, they do better under parliamentary systems, because you can have minorities and smaller groups, etc., represented. In a presidential system, then you end up one guy, then everybody else feels marginalized, and that's what's happening in Afghanistan. So they will have to negotiate that. After the American withdrawal, their biggest challenge will be making sure that Afghanistan does not become the battleground for a new proxy war between India and Pakistan. I am absolutely certain that the Pakistani side is already prepared, and so are the Indians, because the Indians, as you know, have started showing up in Kabul with a kind of frequency and ferociousness that they didn't do before. Modi is not going to be like others, I mean, I always used to joke at one time that India should behave like, a woman who's naturally tall. One of the smart things she can do to find a good partner, a partner that she can walk together with, who's not as tall as her, she can not wear high heels. But Modi will insist on wearing high heels also. He will show up in the region. India is the biggest country in the region, and he will show that he is bigger. And so that will create problems. So domestic politics of Afghanistan will remain complicated, and the regional politics are going to make Afghanistan uncomfortable as well. I'd be happy to come and talk about Afghanistan in a couple of years. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. It's been a very enlightening session, and really, especially after hearing you today, I think that you picked the perfect title for your book, Magnificent Delusions. You've helped us to try to pick apart and understand some of these delusions, but like any interesting and very good talk, I think you've left us all thirsting for more, which is, as you said, a good reason to invite you back. So until then, let me take the opportunity on behalf of everyone here to thank you very much for coming to Ottawa, for coming to the University of Ottawa, for giving this talk.